Welcome to Standard Snapshot, a new series devoted to giving a quick overview of the current Standard format. Standard changes too quickly for decks to remain consistent and relevant long term, making them ineligible for the A Guide to Every Deck series, but there can still be an overview. The first thing to understand about current Standard is that it's dominated by black midrange decks in various configurations. In fact, if you only look at the top decks in the format and combine them into one category, they make up approximately 45% of the entire metagame. Standard is mostly a battlecruiser format at the moment, with play patterns defined by going more over the top or by eking out more value than the opponent. The main differences in the black decks come from running more in different colors, but certain cards are common throughout the various lists. The most prominent among black staple cards is the Meathook Massacre, a sweeper that also gains life upon the opponent's creatures dying, and the life gain ability persists for the rest of the game since it's an enchantment. Meathook Massacre is format defining and is single-handedly suppressing Aggro as an archetype because of how good it is. It's also the most expensive card in Standard, coming in at around $65. Moving on to other black cards, Sheoldred the Apocalypse is a game-defining threat that can drain the opponent's life a lot faster than it first appears and must be dealt with quickly. It's fairly large at 4/5, making it immune to a lot of red removal, and Death Touch means it at least trades with any other creature in combat. It's also the second most expensive card in Standard next to Meathook Massacre, coming in at around $48, and is good enough to be making its way into black decks in Pioneer. Tenacious Underdog is an early threat that becomes a recursive source of card advantage later on, since you can continuously pull it out of your graveyard over and over via its Blitz ability. Black also has some of the best removal and value cards in the format, some notable ones being Infernal Grasp, Graveyard Trespasser, Sorin the Mirthless, the Cruelty of Gix, and various multicolor cards I'll get to shortly. Rakdos Midrange. The main appeal of going into red is Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is one of the best cards in the format. It produces 2 threats, filters through cards, can ramp if the initial token goes unanswered, and the final backside can be a must-answer threat. Bloodtithe Harvester is also a big pull to red, being probably the second best 2-drop next to Tenacious Underdog. Apart from that, there isn't too much pulling you into red, but Fable is that good. Rakdos plays a typical midrange game with an assortment of various threats and cheap removal, although some versions have moved to playing Onikal Anvil and become a sacrifice variant. Grixis, Esper, and Jund. Only 5 of the 10 Triome lands are legal in Standard due to New Capenna, which means decks gravitate towards those color combinations. It's also a testament to how good black is that Grixis, Esper, and Jund are represented while Bant and Naya are not. Grixis is very similar to Rakdos, with the primary draws to blue being Corpse Appraiser and Urtai Resurrected. Corpse Appraiser has a solid cost-to-body ratio and will usually replace itself. Urtai gives the deck a new angle of interaction and can answer most threats, especially Sheoldred. The deck can also be more controlling by splashing into counterspells like Make Disappear. Next up is Esper, which is primarily built off the back of Raffine's Scheming Seer. Raffine is an excellent 3-drop, having high toughness, flying, and ward 1, which makes it obnoxious to dispose of. If left unchecked, it can connive on attack, letting you filter a ton of cards and growing into a legitimate threat. Notably, Raffine itself doesn't have to attack to trigger, and the counters can be placed on other creatures. Phyrexian Missionary is a solid early play and value creature and can rebuy Raffine or other creatures connived by it. It also loops itself in multiples. The Wandering Emperor is another particularly strong draw to white, being among the best cards in Standard and also showing up as far back as Modern. Other off-played white cards are Wedding Announcement and Owl the Dawn Sky. Esper is slower and grindier than the other black decks, typically taking on a more controlling role with counterspells. Jund is best described as the biggest of the black decks, with huge green monsters as its payoffs, including Soul of Windgrace, Workshop Warchief, and Titan of Industry. Jund can either be built as a typical midrange deck in the same vein as Rakdos, or as a bigger, more go-over-the-top variant that uses the Cruelty of Gix as a reanimator card to bring back huge creatures like Titan of Industry. In fact, Jund is the deck that best makes use of Cruelty of Gix. Fable the Mirror Breaker, Liliana, and blood tokens from Bloodtithe Harvester are good sources of discard that enable Cruelty of Gix's reanimation mode. You can even reanimate a giant creature as early as turn 4 if you play Fable, discard a creature, and are able to attack with the Goblin Shaman token to create a treasure, thus playing Cruelty a turn early. You can blitz Workshop Warchief and return it with Cruelty the following turn. Soul of Windgrace is an excellent value creature and source of ramp, turns excess lands into cards, and is somewhat comparable to Omnath. Finally, there's Mono Black Midrange. While Mono Black lacks the great cards in other colors, it makes up for that by having a cleaner mana base and by making the best use of its mana. Mono Black always has something to spend its mana on, including leveling up Evolved Sleeper, transforming Concealing Curtains, blitzing back Tenacious Underdog from the graveyard, and activating Reckoner Bankbuster, ensuring not a single mana goes unspent each turn. It also gains access to the quadruple black costing value card Invoke Despair. Not all decks in Standard are black though, however, you need a really good reason to go a different way. Mono red aggro is what you'd expect, an assortment of fast, aggressive creatures, many of which have haste, backed up by burn spells, Chandra Dressed to Kill, and of course Fable the Mirror Breaker. Additionally, Phoenix Chick, Squee, Dubious Monarch, Chandra, Fable, and Kumano Faces Kakazan provide some resilience against removal and sweepers. Mono white takes the form of a grindy mid-range deck centered on Invoke Justice. This deck stalls the early game with cheap blockers before taking over the late game with big threats and recurring them via Invoke, which also makes the deck's tiny creatures into legitimate threats. It's a testament to how hostile the format is to aggro due to Meathook Massacre that many of the cards found in Pioneer's mono-white humans deck are actually legal in Standard, including Hopeful Initiate, Thalia, Adeline, Brutal Cathar, and Extraction Specialist, yet there's no deck in Standard currently making use of them. Moving on to green-white enchantments, a synergy deck that makes use of Enchantments Matter cards, in particular Generous Visitor, Kami of Transience, and Michiko's Reign of Truth as beaters, Jukai Naturalist to reduce costs, and then capping off with Sarah Paragon, Hallowed Haunting, and various other enchantments that accrue value. Many of the cards in this deck are recursive, including Sarah Paragon on the top end, the Restoration of Aganjo, and Kami of Transience in combination with any other enchantment. Furthermore, enchantment-based removal synergizes with the Enchantments Matter theme of the deck. Mono Blue Tempo is basically an aggro deck that uses a few cheap and efficient creatures, primarily Delver, Ledger Shredder, Haughty Djinn, and/or Tolarian Terror, backed up by cheap counterspells and protection effects. These decks may or may not play combat research, so they can be built similarly to traditional Curious Obsession decks given their abundance of cheap flyers. Regardless, the primary game plan is to resolve one or two cheap threats and ride them to victory by protecting them with counterspells or cards like Shore Up and Slip Out the Back, while also countering any relevant threats from the opponent. Finally, I'd like to highlight 5-color humans. This is an aggro mid-range deck built around human creatures, of which there are a surprisingly large amount of quality candidates in Standard. The 5-color monobase can function due to Secluded Courtyard and Plaza of Heroes being able to cast almost every card in the deck. The creatures themselves are good quality and have a surprising amount of trickiness and complicated lines of play between Catilda's mana and pump abilities, recurring Dennick and making tokens with Jaren, protecting your creatures with Plaza of Heroes or using Wandering Emperor as a combat trick, pumping creatures with Halana and Alina, Lagrella acting as removal, and Shauna and Joda being late-game value engines. Unlike other aggressive decks, 5-color humans is not nearly as exposed to Meathook Massacre due to its abundance of recursive protection, pump effects, and Thalia's tax. The deck is complex to play and requires many reps to understand, but is rewarding. I hope you've enjoyed this quick snapshot of the current Dominaria United Standard format. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. Take care.